On my far left, grandson of President and Mrs. Nixon, great-grandson of Dwight Eisenhower and Mamie Eisenhower. Please welcome Alex Eisenhower to the library. Seated to his right is Dwight Chapin. Dwight is one of the moving forces behind the redo of our museum, if you haven't seen it yet, but he's been a moving force in the Nixon world for as far back as 1962. He served in the White House as Deputy Assistant to the President and Appointment Secretary, and he was there on the night of the phone call. Dwight, welcome. Please go ahead. Next to Dwight, another longtime Nixon aide, also in the administration from the first day, Larry Higby, Deputy Assistant to the President. He worked very closely with H.R. Bob Haldeman, and he is a member of our board and one of the driving members of the foundation for many years. Larry, welcome back. And immediately on my left, a man I just met for the first time tonight. I've heard about him for years. John Price was the Special Assistant to the President and Executive Secretary of the Domestic Policy, Urban Affairs Council, and one of the true movers of domestic policy in the White House, along with Daniel Patrick Moynihan and John Ehrlichman. I want to begin, if I could, because the moon landing and the moon phone call is for many of us a received memory. Now, I remember it. I was 13. I'm 63 now. And I remember being woken up to watch it on TV and to listen to it in Warren, Ohio at 11:48 or whatever it was to be there. But most people learn about it from their parents or their grandparents because we weren't alive then. Alex, I had an occasion to call your Aunt Tricia last week to talk a little bit about the family moment. And I know you've talked to your mom, Julie, about it. Would you tell people what the family was doing that night?
Yes. Well, my mom told me that she was on the second floor of the White House, and they were looking out over the Rose Garden, and they could see her father, the president, talking on the phone to the astronauts. And she said that it was actually the most exciting moment of all of her time in the White House. That moment, watching him speak to another man on another planet, or on the moon. Yep. It was, just so momentous that she actually said it was the best. It was the most exciting electric atmosphere of all of her time in the White House.
You won't be surprised. You probably talked about it. Tricia Nixon Cox told me they would look from the television to the Oval, to the television, back and forth, because they really couldn't quite believe what they were watching. The other part, and I wonder if Julie or your father has mentioned this to you, when it was done, your grandfather arrived back they went down to greet him, and he was completely humbled by the event, totally overwhelmed by the courage of the astronauts and staggered by the history of the moment. Have that come through to you from your mom as well?
Yes, yeah. She said that he was really excited about it, actually. He saw it as a great opportunity to actually bring the world together. And even in his speech, he spoke of, talked about the gray surface of the moon and the Earth, the beautiful Earth. And, he saw it as a moment to bring everybody together in the country, in the world. And I think he just saw it as such an amazing opportunity.
We're going to talk about the context first before we get to the phone call. And I want to begin with some comments about the Soviets. Because as you all know, this began in 1957. I was a year old. It wasn't my fault. The Russians launched Sputnik One, which I don't think anyone is actually old enough to remember on this stage. John, do you remember Sputnik One? Okay, let's get the reaction to Sputnik One. John, go ahead.
Sputnik One was a slap in the face to American complacency. We were in the Eisenhower presidency. It was a benign era of good feelings. The country felt comfortable because they were confident they were being led by an avuncular, intelligent, competent man who knew arms and armies. All of a sudden, Sputnik goes up. I was at Grinnell College that autumn, and it's a small Iowa college, and a physics major, Roger Soderberg, grabbed me and he said, "Let's go see Sputnik." We drove 15 miles out into the even greater darkness north of Grinnell College, and indeed, with the naked eye, could see Sputnik circling the Earth. The next morning, I phoned my grandmother who was the wife of a dairy farmer in southern Iowa. And I said, Grandma, I just watched this Soviet satellite circling the earth up in the heavens. She said, it's not possible. God would not permit it. But permitted he had, and what happened after that was this back and forth of initial Soviet accomplishments, followed by American response, ever in front Soviet accomplishments, followed by American response.
Larry, your recollection of that too?
My recollection really goes back to the fact that I think it probably was the biggest wake-up call the United States could have for any of our space programs, and what resulted from the first time over the next succeeding number of years was truly phenomenal, and we're here celebrating it today.
It did kick it off. Dwight?
Yes, it kicked into motion a chain of events. The United States was not used to being second in anything, and the fact that the Russians got the Sputnik up there and so forth was really a public relations black eye to the administration, and they determined very quickly that it couldn't be this way and that we had to make a change.
You know, early on, the space program is rightly identified with President Kennedy, and I've been in touch with the Kennedy Foundation director because we hope this Apollo 11 exhibit can travel there when it's done here, but I hope you all get a chance to see it because it's so remarkable. But of course, President Kennedy announced in Houston on September the 12th at Rice University that we choose to go to the moon in this decade and do other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Dwight, I'll start with you and come back. When you reflect on what President Kennedy said, the 60s descended into chaos thereafter. Maybe the only thing that held it together was the space program.
Yes, I think this is a very important moment, and we hear it referred to quite often even today, that it would be a Kennedy moment, for example, if somebody today set a goal that we were going to accomplish something in the next decade. America was ready for this call to arms, so to speak, and President Kennedy put it out there. President Nixon was behind it 1,000%. He never wavered on it. He thought Kennedy had made the right decision, and the president was very supportive.
Larry, do you recall it shaping your college years? You're a UCLA guy. Was the space race in the background the whole time?
Yeah, too many things were in the background all the time, including several classes I didn't quite get to. No, I think it did shape and begin to bring focus, which is the word that I always associate with it, whether you were in high school or in college, because it was one of those things that captured the imagination and the concern of the world, not just the United States, the world. And I think our ability to react, as Dwight pointed out to that, and come back strong and accept the challenge and beat the challenge is really what makes the U.S. such a special place to be.
John, you want to add to that? About the whole backdrop of the 60s is divided between conflict and change and the space program.
Very much so. And what the latter did was to give a sense of common purpose, of shared purpose, and finally, a sense of accomplishment and national competence.
Larry, you were in the campaign. Dwight, you were in the campaign. John, were you in the campaign?
I was.
How often did the space program come up in the 1968 campaign? The president won one of the narrowest victories in American electoral history, having lost one in 1960. But what's the space program's role in the campaign, if any? Dwight, you want to start?
Well, at one point in the campaign, I believe it was in early October, James Webb, who was the head of NASA resigned. And one of the reasons he resigned was that the Johnson administration, which would include Humphrey, the candidate that was running against Nixon, that they wanted to cut back on the space program. And the president put forth the president being candidate Nixon, put forth a statement saying that it was imperative, he used the word imperative, that the administration go ahead with the program, fully fund Apollo, and keep it going. But there was a moment in time there where it was becoming a campaign issue.
Larry, do you recall it being shut down right away? Was it a conversation inside the rooms?
Yeah, but a very brief conversation. I think what happened with the space program in general was really more of a backdrop issue that the president saw had value in terms of so many other things he was trying to get done, whether it was weave together an alliance throughout Europe or or Southeast Asia, or bring new people into the alliances that we already had. It was a great calling card that allowed you to get in and do other things.
John, in domestic policy, though, he had a lot to do. It was very expensive. Was there ever any question about the expense overriding the importance of the mission?
The expense was significant. It was something like 4% of the entire federal budget.
Does
which
anyone
is
know that?
Staggering, if you think about it.
It's
4%.
larger than our defense budget as a percentage
Right,
now.
but it was ramped up, and willingly and bipartisanly, and only after, as the joy and the feelings slowly dissipated, were the attacks back on for budgetary reasons. Why, as with the peace and growth dividends supposedly coming from winding down the Vietnam War, why shouldn't we take these monies and apply them to other things, domestic imperatives?
4%
Hugh,
GDP.
The space program is something that's always subject to people saying, why are we doing this and not spending the money on Earth, on projects that would help the citizens of the planet here and particularly in the United States? So the important factor is that there were 400,000 people employed putting together what happened here. I mean, it was a huge, huge industry.
That helps
Number
account for
one.
the 4% of the budget.
Yeah.
Christopher, can you imagine the United States without a space program? I mean, you're one of the younger generation. Can you imagine growing up without all this around you?
Well, my generation takes it for granted. So, by the time I was born, man had already walked on the moon. We'd already seen all this. So it's just part of being an American, just thinking that we could do the impossible. But there have been a lot of times where they talked about, cutting massive funding for NASA, and now they're talking about private industry taking the helm and going up into space now. So, there are times where it felt like there wasn't much of a space program, and there wasn't going to be. But it's exciting to see companies like SpaceX and a renewed interest in space, because I just think it's one of the most interesting things in the world. It is.
It's
the greatest.
absolutely important to remember it was a choice. You had to make a choice to go. You had to make a choice to continue. You had to make a choice that night, and we're going to come to that choice. But President Nixon is inaugurated on January 20th, 1969, exactly 6 months before the lunar landing. And in his inaugural address, he referred to the Christmas Eve 1968 mission of Apollo 8 and to astronaut William Anders, who took a picture near the lunar surface, which he later called Earthrise. That picture featured prominently in President Nixon's Oval Office. A view of it, by the way, hangs in our Oval Office here in Yorba Linda, California. And the president then actually spoke about the mission in his first inaugural address. Let's listen to that excerpt.
Only a few short weeks ago, we shared the glory of man's first sight of the world as God sees it, as a single sphere reflecting light in the darkness. As the Apollo astronauts flew over the moon's gray surface on Christmas Eve, they spoke to us of the beauty of Earth, and in that voice so clear across the lunar distance, we heard them invoke God's blessing on its goodness. In that moment, their view from the moon moved poet Archibald MacLeish to write, "To see the earth as it truly is, small and blue and beautiful, in that eternal silence where it floats, is to see ourselves as riders on the earth together, brothers in that bright loveliness in the eternal code. Brothers who know now they are truly brothers."
Archibald MacLeish, Riders on the Earth Together. Dwight, was that the mood in the country in January of 1969?
The country had been largely divided by 1968. And in 1969, what you hear the president doing there is working and starting to put in place the important job of bringing the country together again. And the rhetoric that he uses is to inspire and to have people have that magic ingredient of dreaming and thinking that things can be better. And the moon program was, if nothing else, was a denominator of spirit in the country. And he knew that was coming, and he brought it to the forefront of the American public because he thought it was so important to lay it in there.
Our late friend Ray Price was very proud of the phrase, the lift of a driving dream, which appears in the inauguration. Do you think that was specific to the moon program or just generally about what RN wanted to accomplish? I'll go to you first, John, and then you, Larry.
I think it was more generally what he hoped to do and what he hoped to restore. Further to the point of how horrible things were, there had been something like 125 urban riots in the cities across America, small and large, in the prior year. And at that very place where he was giving his inaugural address, most of us were sitting in front on the east side of the Capitol building. There were 50 caliber machine guns mounted on the escarpment of either side of the stairs, manned by Army units. At 14th Street, just a few blocks down the road in Washington, there were still gutted, smoldering fires left from problems there. On his way back from inaugural to review the inaugural parade, debris was thrown at his car. These were tense times.
Larry?
I think the whole idea of the dream is very Nixonian. He's always talking about dreams. He's trying to lift the country up and move the country ahead and bring it back together again, to Dwight's point. And I think he works very hard at that. He also had an uncanny sense of timing, of when to take something that's sort of out there and make it the issue. And he clearly used the moon program more than once in that regard. Very, very much unique to this president.
Dwight?
Hugh, I want to mention that I was with Ray Price and with the candidate, Mr. Nixon, when those words were uttered in New Hampshire at the launch of the presidential campaign in 1968. And he talked about what America needed was the lift of a driving dream. So he was into that rhetoric at the very outset of the campaign.
I also want to talk to you three about the space program and the Soviet competition. RN would eventually be remembered as the greatest foreign diplomat as president of anyone who sat in the office, actually doing diplomacy. But when 69 arises, it's not long after the invasion of the invasion of Czechoslovakia. It's in the middle of a Vietnam War where our men and women are being shot at and killed by Soviet weaponry, by their Soviet satellite state. And the Soviets are trying to get to the moon too, I think. So how much of the superpower competition is this realpolitik, and how much of it is the lift of the driving dream going on? Dwight, I'll go back to you since you were the deputy chief of staff.
If nothing else, one of the ways we can define President Nixon was he was incredibly pragmatic. So the answer to your question is yes, the lift of the driving dream was important, but beating the Soviets was equally important.
And real.
And real.
John?
He was indeed both, and the Quaker impulse was in him, unlike in Herbert Hoover, who was the only other Quaker president to serve. The emblem, the logo on the president's grave out here is that it is most important to be remembered as a peacemaker. Pat Buchanan says in his book about Nixon's White House wars that one of the most outstanding and remarkable features of this man was the reality of his commitment to finding peace.
Yes. He was a Quaker. He believed in peace at the center.
Did we begin to talk to the Soviets in '69? I don't recall. I don't believe we did. But
I'm the domestic guy, but I think that they'd started to put out some feelers.
and
They were
does
laying
anyone
the
recall?
groundwork for the SALT talks then.
Does anyone recall how the Soviets reacted to this? I don't.
No, I don't.
What Nixon did, and we'll get to it perhaps, is Mr. Borman brought back some Soviet medals which had been conferred by the Soviet Union on their cosmonauts for acts of bravery and often death in trying to get into space. And Nixon instructed that those medals be taken on Apollo 11 and left on the moon as a gesture of comity to the Soviet Union.
I didn't know that either. Let's talk a little bit about the tension approaching the launch. Was there ever any doubt in your mind on launch day or launch week, Dwight, that it was coming down? Did we know we got used during the Challenger era, shuttle era, to having delays, et cetera, and delays? Was there a countdown that you were stuck on that you knew it was going to be taken off on the 16th and landing on the 20th?
Well, the president's attitude and position on the launch for July 20th, July 16th, and then the landing of on the moon on the 20th, was that it was one thing over which he had no control. This was a NASA operation. The president had delegated authorities, and people that knew the technologies and everything involved were the ones that he was relying on. And this did not involve considerations by the White House in terms of postponements or anything else. If they needed to be done, he would have absorbed them and agreed with what the authorities had said needed to be done.
Was there a science advisor, Larry, to Bob Haldeman or the president? Was there someone who was, or is it just the NASA director who was back and forth
I
with
think
him?
it was direct with the NASA director.
John,
He had a science advisor, Lee
DeBridge.
Oh, yeah.
DeBridge, yes.
Yeah.
All right, so when we get closer and closer to the launch, no presidential event is accidental today. Everything is planned weeks, months, sometimes years in event. When did the planning begin for the night of the launch and the night of the landing and the phone call?
Well, the planning recommendations from NASA probably were being generated back in the later Johnson years. Once the president took office, we had assistant to the president, Peter Flanagan, who became the point person with NASA. And then President Nixon had struck up a friendship with astronaut Frank Borman. And Frank Borman was kind of brought into the inner circle along with Flanagan. And Frank's assignment was to keep the president posted on all of the technical stuff he needed to know about the launch and what was going to happen and help make some of the decisions.
Well, inside baseball, Frank Borman's role, can you expand on it? I know he was at the White House the night of the phone call. Did he have entrance and access as he needed it, Larry? Was this he's a great American, but how did an astronaut fit in with a bunch of staffers who were trying to keep the president on schedule and doing 1,000 different things?
I think he became very quickly a trusted advisor and somebody the president relied on. The other thing, I think the president genuinely liked being with him. Their personalities meshed well. They watched the landing together. And I think had he not wanted to get into private life, probably would have been a significant factor politically, both in the United States Republican Party and probably a significant advisor for the president on an ongoing basis.
On July 16th, when the launch took place, the only person with the president was Frank Borman.
Huh. That occurred at 9:32 in the morning on July 16th, if people do not know. Let's watch that footage just to remember.
30 seconds and counting. Astronauts report it feels good. T-minus 25 seconds. 20 seconds and counting. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence starts. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
Oh, boy. Oh, boy, it looks good,
Tower
Wally.
cleared.
Building shaking. We're getting that buffeting we've become used to. What a moment. Man on the way to the moon.
Now, I see a lot of people younger than me here, Rhett and Irene, my buddies, and many of other people. How many of you went through the experience of having a television rolled into your elementary school classroom so you could watch the launch? Every launch. And I don't realize that happened on Challenger, by the way. I was in the Reagan administration. It traumatized just a generation of children. But how nervous were you three guys when this thing went down?
You mean when it occurred?
Yes, when the launch took off.
As opposed to the 72 seconds after the launch of Challenger.
Yes.
Right? Yeah, okay. I was there.
You
And-
went down to Florida.
Yes, I was there. And we were seated in bleacher like a high school football stadium stands, a good distance away from the actual launch site because of the power of the 7.5 million pounds of thrust. And President Johnson was there. He was in the front row. He had been brought there thanks to Richard Milhouse Nixon, who sent a newly refurbished Air Force One to go and pick up President Johnson and his wife as a gesture of respect and thanks for what Johnson had done about this program. When the actual ignition occurred, being at the distance we were, you heard nothing. There was no audio, only video. And it took a while, but then all of a sudden, the ground began to literally thump under your feet. It shook like it was rolling. And it was only a moment later that the air was literally slapping you against the face.
Wow. How about back at the White House?
Well, it was, I mean, I felt personally like I had a split personality because on the one hand, you were trying to figure out what do you need to do now? And as I think Dwight said earlier, it's out of your control. On the other hand, you're sitting there thinking about all the other things that could go wrong and this chain of events that are going to take place over more than, a number of days. And it really, I mean, you couldn't get it off your mind, but you didn't want to think about it sometimes, It was very unique.
As you would walk down the corridor in the West Wing, you could hear from room to room, every television was on by every staff person in the White House.
Wow. Okay, now, there's been a lot of attention paid in the last couple of weeks to William Safire writing a memo to your boss, Larry, called the In Event of Moon Disaster, offering suggested remarks in the case of a mission failure and that the Apollo 11 astronauts did not survive. Has that been overstated a little bit? Was there more worry than we have been allowed to understand?
I think it was just the White House operating as it always tried to, covering every eventuality. I think it was something that was discussed. They went through it. Then they shelved it and said, this is going to work. We're going to go for it. And we went for it. And the rest is history.
It's interesting that the memo has gotten a lot of attention in the last 10 days. But it's gotten more attention in the last 10 days, 50 years later, than it did 10 days around the actual landing on the moon. I mean, this was not something that was talked about. The day of the event itself of the landing, I do not recall it being mentioned once.
I don't even know where the memo was.
I think it was on a shelf, probably in Haldeman's office. If something had gone haywire, they would have gone and gotten it, but it was not top of mind. It was way down. This was a positive, we're going to do it type of experience. I mean, obviously there was a lot of suspense in it, but I mean, there was no focus on this.
No, there
Alex,
wasn't a constant drumbeat going on of what about.
That was just not there.
No, wasn't there.
Alex, your great-grandfather on the eve of D-Day, I'm sure your father has told you this because we worked on it in the book Eisenhower at War, prepared a memo to the troops, or actually prepared a memo to the world accepting responsibility for the failure of the D-Day invasion. Have you ever talked about that with your father and whether or not your grandfather was impacted by your great-grandfather's sort of contingency planning for the worst case?
Honestly, not too much. It's just been a miracle that the mission was a success. And, they just moved forward from that. I mean, he had so many decisions that were life or death that he had to make in his life, just sending people off to their deaths constantly.
So
and it was just
constantly
one more success. I don't know how he handled it.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about the day of. Let's switch to the day of. And Dwight Chapin, President Nixon held a Sunday church service on the day of the lunar landing. Later, Buzz Aldrin would hold a church service on the moon that was not allowed to be broadcast because of concerns that the ACLU would object. But tell us about the church service that the president went to and why and how it occurred.
The president and Mrs. Nixon established, when they came into the White House, Sunday church services in the East Room, non-denominational. And on this particular Sunday, the 20th of July, 1969, they had as the presiding minister the minister from Whittier College, where the president had gone to college, a Quaker. One of the featured parts, besides the prayers of a safe landing and a safe return, one of the featured little talks was by Frank Borman, who read from Genesis, and he read what he had read around Christmas time of 1968 as they circled the moon, and he read Genesis back to Earth. And that got an incredible amount of attention at that time, and it was repeated at this church service.
I have read today, in preparing for this, that Madalyn Mary O'Hare had objected to the reading, and then Buzz Aldrin, who's a Presbyterian elder in the Webster Presbyterian Church outside of Houston, had requested to receive the elements of the Presbyterian communion on the moon, and he did, in fact, but they went radio silent for that because of the objection to Frank Borman's reading the Genesis. They didn't want that.
Hugh, I could say this, that if anybody had objected to Frank Borman reading that Genesis at that church service, President Nixon would have made sure that Frank Borman read that Genesis.
Probably twice. Larry,
Backwards.
Bob Haldeman wrote in his diary, President Nixon, quote, was really intrigued with his participation in the moon landing events. You're working closely with HR Bob Haldeman every day. What's that mean? How's that translate?
Well, you knew Bob. He was a fairly serious man and didn't suffer fools or anybody else lightly. He was really focused on the president and what we could get done in the time that we had. And looking at that whole thing, it became pretty obvious that we needed to move very, very strongly to try and integrate the space program into the other things that we were doing. And it was one of the few times when I actually talked to him afterwards. There was glee, absolute glee, I think, on the part of the president, clearly on the part of Bob, and clearly one of the reasons because Bob was so pleased to see the president was happy about this whole thing. And it really set up for the next several days just a tremendous amount of joy throughout the White House and I think throughout the nation.
Dwight?
Yes, well, it's very telling in the diaries. What Larry says is so true, and Bob was a serious man. But he chronicles that the president, when Neil stepped on the moon, the president went, hooray, that's in there, and that he was ecstatic. I mean, the language that Bob is using reflects significantly the president's attitude.
Now, we have a special treat. I don't know how you couldn't get a Super 8 camera into the White House today, Dwight, but you got your Super 8 camera into the White House.
I did.
How often did you take a Super 8 camera into the White House?
I took a Super 8 camera into the White House every day. And Bob Haldeman had one, I had one, and we used it. Here's some footage of, there's Roger Ailes, who was our technical advisor, who later went on to notoriety at Fox. There's Bob Haldeman at his desk working on some papers, and you'll see here in a second that he's conferring with Roger Ailes. This is during the day while we are all waiting. There was a lot of waiting time going on this particular day. There's Frank Borman, and Frank is in a room that you never see. That's the president's little office that is off of the Oval Office, and that is the set on which President Nixon watched the lunar landing. There's Frank on the phone, probably with NASA. And these, as Hugh said, these are home movies that we took. So they're 50 years old. So the quality of it. There's the little TV that the president watched it from, and I think that's Frank Reynolds there. There's Ron Ziegler, the press secretary, and we are in the cabinet room. We used the cabinet room there. You can see that's Ollie Atkins, who was the official photographer. The guy with the cigar, that cigar was Bruce Wheelahan. The guy with this cigar is me. And don't ask why we smoke cigars, but we did. And we really staked ourselves into the cabinet room there throughout the day. You can see the windows were dark, so we're into nighttime. The module landed at 4:15 in the afternoon, and then the astronauts did not walk until later. This is a still shot of the cabinet room. The Oval Office is down through that doorway. There's a little office area, and then the Oval Office, and we're all sitting around there waiting. The president at this time is over in the executive office building, but this was right ahead of the actual moonwalk.
I want to come back to the old EOB hideaway in a second, but I note a lot of ashtrays here.
Yes. Well, this
I mean,
was
a lot of
this was a
ashtrays.
different era.
Yeah, that's a lot of ashtrays.
The usage significantly declined as the administration went forward.
But I also noted, I don't think, can we replay that home movie? Is that possible? I want to go back and play the home movie again because I think people are amazed. The cigar smoking in the White House is really I don't think that's allowed by law anymore.
Well,
Here we go. Narrate again for us.
Yeah, that's Bruce Wheelahan. He worked for Ron Ziegler, and he was in charge of the press. Roger Ailes again, who was the television advisor, and basically got the president prepped as to exactly how everything was going to work and what the cues were. There's Bob at his desk, and Roger again talking
Roger's
things
close,
over.
but no cigar.
Again, you can see the windows. It's dark out, so this is later in the day or evening. And Frank, again, probably on the phone with NASA. He was constantly getting updates and trying to check to make sure everything was working the way that we had been told it was going to work. And then Frank would give the cues to Roger Ailes. And again, that's the little tiny set. I mean, that's what, a 20-inch color set. Yeah, but the president never watches television, Larry's saying. And Ollie Atkins, the official White House photographer, and Bruce. And again, to self-promote. Yeah.
Okay, walk me through what you three did on that day. Obviously, you were running around with a camera, Dwight, but how about you, John?
I was, thanks to
That's
Dwight
not
Chapin,
fair.
I was sitting right there. You caught the back of my head and my right hand lifting a cigar.
You were too?
I was there.
You're part of the cigar
right there.
brigade?
Yeah, I was. And I had hair. I don't smoke anymore, and I have no more hair. But then that evening, and again, thanks to Dwight, I moved on into the Oval Office.
Yeah. Hugh, the staff people, it was a waiting process.
Yes, hurry up and wait. Really.
I mean, we got there, mid-morning, and we're waiting until 4 o'clock for the landing, and then we're waiting until late evening, and so we're sitting around chatting, trying to figure out, talking to Frank Borman. If you look at the phone log, I got like 6 or 7 calls from the president that lasted about a minute or 30 seconds or something, because he was over in his office and he's antsy, wanting to make sure that what's going on and so forth. So it was kind of like a hurry up and wait type thing.
And a lot of people were in their offices because the one thing you didn't want to have happen is any kind of communications breakdown, and you wanted to have something in place. So boom, you could just switch to another line or to another office immediately. So as Dwight said, it was sort of hurry up and wait.
Now we have media circuses where it's considered an enormous event if 25 to 30 million people watch something. Super Bowl's bigger, but there are 1.5 billion people watching this thing. What was the media doing that night?
Well, the media that night, let's go back. We're talking ABC, NBC, and CBS. I mean, it was a different media world. This was going to be covered by a pool, which meant that there would be a representative media people in there that would feed the information to all of the others. So it was not the big elaborate media circus that it would be today.
Yeah, there weren't 100 people sitting there yelling and
No.
asking questions and that sort of thing. The media had its own specific area inside the West Wing, and a lot of the offices had to be manned for any eventuality.
John.
Yes, in the Oval Office that night, you had the network television cameras, and you also had some of the print press there, and still photographers came in later. But the mood there was fascinating because the media folks, like the rest of us, were very subdued. And there was an extraordinary mood, I felt, in the room after we settled down and the moment came near.
Now, this is a completely non-contentious type of a thing. I mean, there is no one going on that's questioning why this is happening or why are we spending money here or what anything. I mean, this is suspense 101. I mean, what is going to happen next? Is it going to go against plan and not, some gotcha or getcha type thing?
Yeah, that was Walter Cronkite was very pro-administration that evening.
Well, talk to us a little bit about what it was like to be in the White House when man landed on the moon.
Well, I'll say simply that a roar went up from our group in the cabinet room there, just a raucous scream, which probably was echoed in living rooms and bars and railroad stations all over the world. It was just a moment of absolute excitement.
Larry?
I would agree with that completely. It was amazing to me. There was a kind of a hushed calmness almost after the roar, and people were just transfixed on the whole issue and what we had done as a nation, what this meant to the world, and sort of asked you to think again about your place in the world and where you really were not part of something that was so much bigger than you ever even dreamed.
I think we're going to see some footage here in a few minutes that let me speak to right now briefly, and that is that the overall feeling of the White House is exemplified by the president, and he is riveted to looking at the television. I mean, this is it. You'll see him here in a second. He's getting, but he starts watching what's happening in front of him on the set. This is the technical crew getting ready. This would be once he had been advised that there's going to be, that we're getting ready with the call. There's Roger, there's Frank, the president. It's interesting, for sound reasons, his whole top of his desk we covered with brown felt, trying to keep the noise level down. Now here he is, he's starting to look at the TV and watch what's happening. He's getting interrupted by Roger there, but he'll come back to it in a second. And he just kept his focus on what the men were doing. Right now he's getting Roger's explaining to him what the NASA has said. He's asking about the call. Frank's on with NASA. That's the pool camera that fed all the networks. There's Ailes again.
I want to cue that again to watch, but I'm going to preface it by saying he had spent the early evening in his hideaway in the old executive office. Yeah. And so when did he come over? Walk us through one more time, Dwight.
He came over to the little office right before Armstrong stepped on the moon, and Haldeman and Borman were with him in the little office when that happened. Once it happened, he then came into the Oval Office, and there's Roger briefing him, Frank, the president wiping the moisture off his lip, which was a constant thing. The felt on his desk there. He's watching. I thought that there was more footage of this part, but there's not. He's just looking at the TV set. It's interesting, there were two sets, one on the right and one on the left, because we did not know on which side, how NASA was going to put the picture. And so Roger had devised that if the astronauts were on the right, Nixon would be on the left looking at them. but he would switch over the other way if the astronauts were on the left. Nixon would have been on the right.
You know, there isn't any makeup person in the room.
No, you didn't need makeup. Probably, let me think. Maybe under our formula, maybe he had spent the weekend before in Key Biscayne. And one of the tricks with Richard Nixon that we learned, that he learned early on from 1960 and Jack Kennedy, was that he looked a heck of a lot better when he had a tan, and therefore he spent a lot of time in Florida.
But all of you would know, Alex, you'll know, the modern media world is nobody goes anywhere without hair and makeup, and they would have been all over him today. And in 2019, 50 years later, you don't talk for 30 seconds without hair and makeup if you're a public figure.
Well, do we have on our makeup? I don't know. No.
Talk to me a little bit about the tension about the phone call as we approach the 10 minutes to go mark. We had Doug earlier today talking about this extraordinary technical event. Were you worried about, at that point, the big thing is work. They're on the moon. That the little thing, the phone call, is an amazing technological achievement. Who was running that rope line at the White House?
My answer would be WACA, the White House Communications Agency, and that's part of the Department of Defense. And when their sheet came in, it's the one that says the president's call, and it puts the time, and it says the call to the Sea of Tranquility, the moon.
We have those notes in the exhibition. It's really kind of, it says call to the Sea of Tranquility on the moon. How much time did he spend prepping for what he would say to the astronauts? Do any of you know?
No, I don't.
I can't say.
I would say probably considerable time knowing him. I can envision that he was over in the EOB office with his yellow pad on his lap, and that he wrote out several different thoughts that he might have on how he would do it. This is a man who always prepared. And he always loved to tell the story about Winston Churchill, and how Churchill, one time somebody came up to Winston Churchill and said, how in the world, those spontaneous remarks of yours are so special, they're so great. And Winston Churchill said, some of the hardest work I do is writing those spontaneous remarks.
You know, just to add to that, he often would come out of the Oval Office with a bunch of paperwork and give it to me. And one of the things we always did is we had special remarks for anything he might be speaking about ahead of time. And he would literally, the process was always the same. He'd read them, turn the page over, write out his own remarks, look at it quickly, toss it in the outbox, and then he'd sit there and give those remarks word for word for word perfectly, with no notes in front of him. And if you notice there's no note in front of him here.
Could I just bring it back for a moment to
Please.
him sitting at that desk and Dwight's point earlier, the intensity with which he was watching those three consoles. When the astronauts were out on the moon and about to talk to him, they lifted a flag through a lanyard, and it extended the flag as though wind were blowing it. And at that point, Nixon clapped about 3 or 4 times and saluted in the room. And then you're speaking of the press and the relationship, and Dwight saying again the wonderful mood. At the very end of the talk, some wag in the press spoke up, and the president rather said, "I'd hate to get the toll charges on that call." and one of the press guys said, "Make it collect."
Yeah.
Let me ask you if any of you have any memory. President and Mrs. Nixon are buried outside in a very wonderful last resting place. Mrs. Nixon, so central to his life, so wonderful to everyone who worked for her. Do you have any recollection of how she approached this evening and how she approached the space program in particular?
I don't. In fact, when Alex was talking, the girls watching through the window, and I don't know whether they referenced whether Mrs. Nixon
She was there.
up.
Tricia told me she was there. Is that
Okay, so
what you
she
know?
was up there watching down. But then when he finished, your mother and dad and your aunt went down to the Rose Garden. And when he got done doing the simulation for the photographers, after the call, there was a press opportunity for the photographers. And then he got up and walked through the Rose Garden doors. And that's when your mom and dad and aunt greeted him in the Rose Garden. And Mrs. Nixon was still up in the mansion, I believe.
So in terms of the number of people in the room for this, I counted 6. That's not a normal, was that a normal? Did he keep his office staff small and in the room? Because
You mean when this happened?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Rule 1A was staff, unless you needed to be there, you weren't there.
And so, Larry, how many people were in the cabinet room?
Well, the cabinet room's different.
Right.
The cabinet room is totally different because,
Right.
I mean, it's someplace where the staff is now gathered.
So how many are in?
But
Are there
there's-
20 people in there? Or
No,
that-
I
no,
would
no.
say 6 or 8,
Yeah.
just like it showed in there. But you got to remember, for a good portion of this, most of the staff needed to be in their office.
Well,
Why?
the other part, Larry,
Because-
is it was Sunday,
Yeah.
and a lot of people just weren't in.
But they, as Dwight said, you could go down the hall and you would see the TVs on, and there's usually at least one staff person, if not more, manning that office.
I can't imagine someone not going to the White House on the day that they're landing on the moon. Did someone say they had something better to do that
Right.
day?
I don't think so.
What was Bob Haldeman doing so central to the presidency and to the president's? What was he doing during this period of time?
Well, he was with the president for a good portion of time, but he also was along with Frank providing information and remember, we were getting ready to leave on a trip, weren't we?
In his diary, he says that he, for part of the afternoon, he went back to the hotel. He was still living in a hotel. They had not moved permanently to
To Jefferson.
Washington, and he was packing
Yeah.
for the trip.
I mean, it was a pretty tight schedule for those guys.
And so after this is done, and we'll watch it in 5 minutes, 50 years to the moment, how long until he leaves the White House to go and greet them? Splashdown is in 3 days, right, after this?
Right.
How long does he wait till he leaves?
The walk was on the 20th. He stayed at the White House on the 21st, and on the 22nd, he flew to San Francisco. The 23rd, he flew to Johnson Island, and from Johnson Island out to the USS something,
Hornet.
Arlington. He spent the night on the Arlington, and then at 4 a.m. the next morning, by helicopter went from the Arlington to the USS Hornet. And when the splashdown occurred, the helicopter that picked the capsule up brought it to the Hornet. And the president was on the Hornet when the helicopter brought the astronauts to the Hornet.
So the whole world was watching, and they stayed watching. John, I remember in my prep for this, you traveled with a French person down to Cape Canaveral. Who was that?
His name was Jean Saint-Denis, and he was my seatmate on Air Force Two going down. And we chatted amiably about a lot of things. He had been raised in the French colonial service, had been a tutor to the Emperor Bao Dai of Vietnam, was living in Hanoi when the Japanese invaded, and was imprisoned, interned during the war, and then saw on the steps of Hanoi's City Hall in 1945 Ho Chi Minh visiting with American OSS officers. He told me all about this and later sent me a book he'd written. What I did not know, and what was meant not to be known, was that this was a cover for him. He was the director of Air France. He'd been in the Gaullist government as a minister. And he was going down to watch the space launch as an Air France director, state-owned airline. P.S. The reality was, as Dwight knows, that he had come actually in to see Nixon and Kissinger the day before because he was the intermediary between Richard Nixon and Ho Chi Minh. And he was the guy who was opening the path to the negotiations. And it was the first meeting they'd all had together. He carried a letter from Nixon to Ho. And then the very first meeting between Kissinger and the Viet Cong was held in his apartment in Paris.
So where, as we get to the 2-minute mark, where were Dr. Kissinger, Secretary of State Rogers, Secretary of Defense Laird, and the Vice President at this point?
They were all playing gin rummy together.
Well, I know Henry was in New York because on the phone log he called Henry and had a actually a very long conversation that day. The Vice President is not on the phone log for that day, nor is the Secretary of State, so I don't know where they were.
And so as we get there, there are thousands of people involved in this. We're 2 minutes away from 50 years ago. Thousands of people have got to execute. Was he nervous at all?
Was he nervous? Nervous is not a word that I, anticipatory is the word that was used in one of the films that we did. And I think that there was just this high degree of expectation of something big transpiring. But I would not use the word nervous.
I think focus can come a little closer to it, but with, as Dwight says, this sort of expectation on top of it.
Well, we are now at 8:47, and the phone call occurs at 8:48. So I'm going to just walk into the break, and we can anticipate the president waiting. This is a replica of the green phone, which is on, the real phone is in our exhibit. You can go in and see it. Put yourself in the mind of Richard Nixon waiting to talk to people on the moon in the longest phone call in history.
It's Frank Borman that gives him the cue here.
Oh, he does?
Yes. You don't see it, but that's what happened.
Yeah, I think something rather important is coming up here.
Neil and Buzz, the President of the United States is in his office now and would like to say a few words to you. Over. That would be an honor. Go ahead, Mr. President. This is Houston out.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room at the White House. And this certainly has to be the most historic telephone call ever made from the White House. I just can't tell you how proud we all are of what you have done. For every American, this has to be the proudest day of our lives. And for people all over the world, I am sure that they too join with Americans in recognizing what an immense feat this is. Because of what you have done, the heavens have become a part of man's world. And as you talk to us from the sea of tranquility, it inspires us to redouble our efforts to bring peace and tranquility to earth. For one priceless moment in the whole history of man, all the people on this earth are truly one. One in their pride in what you have done, and one in our prayers that you will return safely to earth.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's a great honor and privilege for us to be here representing not only the United States, but and of peace of all nations, and with interest and a curiosity and with a vision for the future. Honor for us to be able to participate here today.
And thank you very much, and I look forward, all of us look forward to seeing you on the Hornet on Thursday.
Wow.
Splashdown should be on Thursday, 1,250 miles southwest of the Pacific, out of Honolulu, Hawaii.
You need to hear them then. What did he do immediately after he hung up? Did he walk out to the Rose Garden to meet Mrs. Nixon and the girls?
Immediately after what you just saw, there was a pause, and then the White House photographers all came in, and they did the still shots that ended up in the, in all the newspapers and so forth, and that took probably 5 minutes, and then he got up and went out to the Rose Garden to see Alex's parents and so forth.
Now, you know what Tricia Nixon Cox told me 2 days ago is that he was incredibly humbled by talking to these people, that it was not a celebratory moment for him, but just one of, as he said in his moment, of being incredibly proud to be an American. I wonder if you three would have a reflection on that.
Yes, I'm sure in his heart of hearts he was feeling tremendous pride in what had happened for the nation and what these men had accomplished.
And I think that was true throughout the White House.
Yes, and it is so indicative of the kind of role a president can play at a moment like this, of understanding the breadth of the people's interests whom you represent.
Alex, would you remind us of what your mother said about that night? It's on the quote in the wall in the museum.
She just remembered it being the most electric moment of her time in the White House. It was the most excited she was the entire time. Another thing her grandmother told her was when they went on the Goodwill trip, Operation Moonbeam, and they were traveling around, the hundreds of the people that came up to Nixon and Pat, they were calling them Moon King and Moon Queen, which I thought was very interesting for their role in the whole event. So that must have been pretty interesting.
I want to talk about the splashdown now. Bob Haldeman writes that the splashdown happened in spectacular fashion in the South Pacific. A fireball rose from the horizon, arched through the sky, turning into a red ball and then disappearing. Dwight, we've got some more footage. Can you describe for us what's going on the USS Hornet here?
Okay, the helicopter you see here has the astronaut. They have just landed on the Hornet. They've been picked up in the water. The band is playing Columbia, the Gem of the Ocean, because the spacecraft was called Columbia. You'll notice that the helicopter is going down below. The men went below deck here and then were taken out of the helicopter through an air chamber, and they went into the well, we'll see that in a minute here. The president is with Tom Paine in the glasses on the right. He is the head of NASA. They're aboard the Hornet. And on the left, you can see the image of Secretary of State Rogers, who was there. Now, this is where the president talked to the astronauts. They're in this, basically an Airstream holding area, which they had to stay in for how many weeks? 2 weeks, I think. On the right there is Admiral John McCain, John McCain's father, who was chief of the operations in the Pacific. Here is the president. The astronauts had now gotten into this unit from the helicopter, and they are at this window, and they are talking to the president. Now, this is Super 8 footage. I think we have some actual footage here coming up of the voices. But that's the president, very animated and really getting a kick out of this. I mean, and there's Buzz Aldrin. He's getting a kick out of it too.
We will have Dr. Aldrin here on Tuesday night to honor him with the Richard Nixon Greatest Comeback Award ever on Tuesday night here in the East Room. From here, the president goes on to Guam. Why is that? What is the purpose of going to Guam? We had Richard Grinnell, the ambassador to Germany, here to talk about the address he gave that day, but why then on to Guam?
Well, Guam, because we are in the process here of adjusting body clocks and getting ready for a launch from Guam into Manila. Our first stop was Manila, and in fact, this is the motorcade leaving the airport in Manila. You see the landing on the moon. This was just along the way. All the kids with the flags, and there we are. There are the astronauts on the moon. This is the start, the first stop on the goodwill trip that the president did after the moon landing. And the goodwill trip, you can see here, the Philippines, Indonesia, Thailand, India, Vietnam, Pakistan, Romania, and Great Britain. Huge crowds everywhere we went. And of course, this had all been timed to be immediately after the moonwalk, and had been done with the idea it was going to be a successful venture. And this was with the Vietnam War and everything, this is a way of trying to bring back United States prestige in the world.
How much planning went into this? This must
Lots
have
of
been...
planning went into this. This trip was incredibly complicated, particularly the Romania stop and the Pakistani stop. Both were complicated. Both of those countries ended up with, they had leaders who had ties to the Chinese, and it was part of the strategy that eventually led to the president going to China.
Let's go to the dinner, because we're wrapping up here. The astronauts have to be in quarantine for a long time. They make a triumphant return to the United States. Here are the dinner on August 13th, before they leave on the goodwill tour. What was that like?
Well, exuberant. I mean, the president was in euphoria, ecstatic to have these men going around the world on their goodwill trip to represent the United States and what had been accomplished. It was, put another way, it was harvesting all of the greatness that had been accomplished.
You know, I don't know that people know this, but when they visited Mexico City, 7 million people lined the road from their landing to their... 7 million people came out to see them when they landed. They were really extraordinary celebrity in the age before celebrity buzz, and Neil might have been and Michael Collins, the most famous men on the planet.
Well, and if you had to pick one word to put with them, they were authentic.
John, you want to add to that? Larry?
I would just say that's a good definition. They're the rock stars of the world.
They get back to the White House 2 days after the silent majority speech. What was the impact of having them back after the round the world? By this point, it's July, August, September, October, November. It's been 4 months. They're still superstars and rock stars. How important is it when they come back?
So November 5th?
Yes.
They came back? That's very interesting. I never had put that together. The silent majority speech was a very famous speech that the president gave where he called on the great silent majority to speak up on the Vietnam War. So I believe that the great silent majority was further impacted by this picture you see here and by the president being with the astronauts on the South grounds.
I'd like to wrap by talking a little bit about the impact of the Apollo mission generally. I do believe what you just said, in fact, coalesced the vast population of the United States into being proud Americans, again, despite divisions about the war. But you guys lived it, so you tell me, John.
I think, as Bill Safire has said of Richard Nixon, he's a layer cake. And I think one of the elements that was probably in his mind and heart is one that struck people all over the world, whether they're religious, secular, and it's summarized by the Airman Sonnet, which goes, the first and last phrases go something like this: I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies. I have trod the untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God. At one level, I think people felt that. At another level, bringing it closer to earth, down to earth, English was the language spoken in that one sentence by Neil Armstrong. English was the language spoken in this phone conversation, heard by a quarter of the population of the earth. So there was definitely a moment of an American moment. And that was then followed up by all kinds of tactical moves. President Nixon, for example, took on one of his visits to Brezhnev in the Soviet Union a piece of moon rock to present him. Well, now there are lots of ways of looking at that. It was a nice tactical move. It was a nice way of saying, we beat you. and that moon rock sits in the Cosmonaut Museum right now in Russia, in Moscow. But there were so many layers to this, but they start, I think, with a deeply spiritual one.
He gave all the leaders of both parties a little tiny piece of the moon rock also, despite the fact NASA wasn't really excited about that whole thing. The thing I think about the silent majority, to connect it, is I got the feeling that was the first time he really felt he broke through and really had established a unique and separate group of people that really were more pro-American and more proud and willing to speak up about what we had done, whether it was the moon rock or anything else. The name, the silent majority, I think really resonated with him and an awful lot of people and gave him a path to move forward.
An ultimate question or comment, Dwight, about the impact of the mission, because I want to close with Alex.
I just would like to say that the Kennedy assassination and 9/11 served in each in its own way to bring Americans together. And what's so special about this particular event, and we've heard it referred to in terms of the hundreds of millions of people that watched it, is this event truly brought the whole world together. And I guess I want to say that the world could use another event like this.
Alex, I want to close with you. Earlier tonight in a small dinner, you told us about playing flashlight tag with your grandpa, Ba, I believe you called him. When you were young, did it ever occur to you, this is the fellow who called the moon, this is the guy who called the shot to go after the technological difficulty? I mean, what is your reflection watching this tonight?
It's always interesting looking at him as a historical figure, especially since I didn't really know a whole lot of what he did as president. I sort of shied away from politics when I was younger. I just looked at him strictly as a grandfather. So it's always really fascinating just seeing just how much of an impact he has on the world. I mean, his signature is on the moon right now. That blew me away when I heard that today. So. Yeah, it's just, it's amazing, all the things he's accomplished and that he was able to be a part of this.
He signed a plaque that is on the moon, and the plaque says, "We came in peace for all mankind."